So this session is about collaborative contracting with children and young people, the creative approach. So, and I'm sort of doing this by request of a couple of people actually. So we'll see. As we know, it's being recorded. So just be careful about only sharing stuff that you're comfortable with sharing publicly, and don't obviously share any client material. So in the session here today, I wanted to just explore a couple of key issues that can influence contracting when we're working with children and young people, and explore what goals and preferences and outcomes might look like when working with younger clients. People who are here, do you work with children and young people, or not really? Yeah. Well, hopefully I'm not going to teach anyone to suck eggs, and if I am, speak up, because I don't want to do that. And doing sessions like this, it's sort of hard to know what people know, if you know what I mean. But I thought not one but two creative little things I thought I would introduce you to. Hopefully you haven't heard of either of them, so it'll be interesting. And I thought we could do a bit of experiential in the second part. So hopefully you've got, all you need is minimal pencils and if you've got two colours or pen or pencils, that's great. If not, one will do. That's all you need is paper and pen and pencil. Okay. So one of the first things just to say is that referral and assessment are sort of intertwined, and they really are dependent on the counselling context. When there is a referral, the counselling, the structure of the context of the counselling often determines what information is sought, as well as the model. Depending on the model, different models have got different ways of assessing or different types of information that they might be seeking or not assessing. And it's really important to know what it is we are assessing. Are we assessing a symptom, a child, or suitability for counselling? Because they're different things to be assessing. So I think it's really important to have that in mind when we're doing assessments. There are lots of formal tools and resources around that you can look up. They're very widely available and they're different. But there isn't one single referral route or way that people come to therapy. There are a multitude of ways, a multitude of settings. School referral will be different from a community-based service. Private practice, again, children come to that in a different type of way. And that really shapes, if a parent is bringing a child and paying, that's a very different context to if a child is at a school and has been referred by a teacher. Do you agree? I mean, that's very different context around the child, and that changes expectations and of the therapist maybe, and of the child and young person. So that's a real influencing factor. I thought, I hadn't looked for a little while, so I thought I'll have a look at some example forms. So I just Googled, so here's a referral form. Okay, so this would be a way that a child would come. You can see there's child's details, school, contact details, parent, carer, address. Then some intervention information about what type of things they may have had, statement of outcomes, so understanding what's happened previously in terms of any therapy. Then there's a box here to comment on their ability to make and sustain friendships, time frame of difficulties, whether they're problematic, network and support, who gives the child help, are they involved with children's services, which can be important to know, previous help, history and observation, presenting difficulties, risk assessment. And then there's something there about assessment tools at the bottom that might be attached, so whether an SDQ will be used or one of the other tools. All looks pretty standard, doesn't it? So we'll have a look. Here's another one. Again, similar type of information, date of birth, name, reason for referral to include presenting problems and impact on child and family, significant events. Surprising how often this doesn't come into a referral, but anyway, has there been a recent bereavement or not? Medication, additional information, other agencies, outcomes that we hope to see as a result of the referral. So, what do you notice about these forms? Anything? Ashley, yeah. Do you want to unmute, Ashley?
Yes, I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it looks fairly standard, actually, the form. But one of the things that I'm wondering about in the settings that I work in, I'm actually kind of head of a counselling service, and we would separate the referral reason from the name and address for GDPR and confidentiality.
Yeah, that probably, yeah, I think that's probably the necessity. Anything else though that you notice, or what does anyone notice?
There's quite a lot to write, so there's quite a lot of information here. Is this to be filled out by the child or the parent?
Well, exactly. There's no space here for child voice.
Doesn't look very child friendly to me. It's a lot of information.
There's not even a space for asking the child. There's no space there saying, does the child want to come? How does a child see the problems? There is no space here. What do you hope to see? No space for what does a child want to work on. And that's not uncommon, because referral forms tend to be written by organisations that are looking for information, and they tend to be organisation centric and adult focused very often. So there very often is a lack of voice. And as a practitioner who works with children and young people, it's our responsibility to take extra steps to enable that. So I'm not saying these are terrible forms, and chances are they're an initial form, and when the child gets there, somebody would do something about balancing it. But I just thought it's just worth flagging up how little space there is for child voice very often at referral. I don't think that's that uncommon. I had a quick look, and I hadn't looked for a little while, but it does seem to be improving. There are some really good resources out there, and I think things are changing. So that is good. And collaboration with the child is absolutely vital. It's embedded in the competencies. The new competencies have it embedded in the framework. There's a need for collaboration and collaborative assessment. So what might that look like when we're working with a child or a young person? The first thing I think to think about is to understand and get into a child's frame of reference, and pay attention to whose agenda is it when a child comes to therapy. Very rarely does a 5-year-old pick up a phone and self-refer to a private practitioner. They're going to come because a parent's bringing them, or a teacher, somebody, depending on the age of the child, depending on the context. Very often it's an adult who is highlighting a need or a requirement, and really important to pay attention to the agenda. Perhaps parents are worried, perhaps teachers are worried about them, but the child may have a very different view. And how they make sense of why they have come to therapy is really important. And sometimes it takes a bit of attention being paid to what's not said as well as what is said. So as an example, here's Connor. Mum says I have to come because I'm still too upset about my sister dying last year. That's actually real. This is a genuine thing that has been said to me. And when you look at that comment, whose problem is this really? It's really a parent's inability to manage the grief of their child. Understandably, that gets put onto the child as the child's problem because they're still too upset. Absolutely appropriate for a child to be upset a year later, but if mum and dad can't cope with it, it's a problem. Very easy for children to be medicalised and have adult issues attached. So Ravi, I get really angry in class. Teacher says if I come here, you'll fix me. Really common. I've heard that multiple times. Sure, a lot of you have. This one's terrible. This one makes me want to cry. My dad died 10 weeks ago. I didn't go to the funeral. The social worker didn't think it was important because he didn't live with us. Doesn't matter now anyway. I don't know why I get angry. My foster carer says I'm angry when I've got nothing to be angry about. Where do you start with that? And the referral form would say angry, young boy, disruptive, or whatever. So really important to have these conversations with young people when they come. Mum said she'd bring me to counselling if I stopped seeing Matt, and Mum said I shouldn't talk about her hair either. So just be aware that they come with baggage, with sometimes instructions, with feelings of guilt about talking about a parent potentially, or maybe instructions not to. So there can be some unpicking and work to be done at the start of contracting, because also it's not appropriate to say, don't worry about what mum said, say anything you like here. You can't just wreck the child or young person's world, and because these are their loved ones. So it takes some sensitivity to work with. Hopefully I'm not teaching you to suck eggs yet. Hopefully this is interesting or a good refresher. So when we come to look at collaborative contracting, using art materials is just a really helpful way. It can really facilitate, particularly with a younger child. And collaborative contracting, the contracting process probably will start with structural aspects such as things like confidentiality, location, number of sessions, timing, duration. How much of that would you think is negotiable? Let's say with, I don't know, a 15-year-old. Is any of that negotiable, the 15-year-old, would you say? Some nods, yeah. Ashley, yeah.
I think it just depends on the setting to some extent, Annie. You know, the number of sessions, I like to work with young people when they can come as frequently as they feel they need to, but sometimes that's driven by how many sessions they're allowed by the school, or how much money mum and dad have got to pay for sessions, or in the voluntary sector there usually is a limit too. So I think that the referral, how the referral comes in really depends on what you can do in that contracting in the early stages and the flexibility.
Absolutely. So some of it isn't negotiable. Some of it is context dependent. And it does depend on things like parents, whether parents will bring them or not, whether parents have got money or not. That is dependent. They don't have the same level of freedom because they're not self-sufficient very often. But what about with maybe a 6-year-old? Would we negotiate? Would you negotiate number of sessions, frequency? Some people are nodding, some people are shaking their heads. Actually, absolutely should. Absolutely. I think often adults really aren't aware of how able children and young people are. And very many 5 and 6-year-olds are incredibly insightful and able to engage in collaborative negotiation, even around things like frequency and duration. I always negotiate with my young people, regardless of age. They have the same rights, and just there is an age-dependent understanding, but that's the role of the therapist to work with that, not to discount their right to have some collaborative negotiation. That they're still absolutely entitled to that, have a say, have a voice. It's the role of the therapist, in my view, that has to then enable that. But then we come to the therapeutic contracting, which is another part. So there's the structural contracting, that's appropriate, but also collaborative contracting around what are we here to do, what is it you want to happen, and that can include things like aims and goals. Now, an adult word would be aims and goals, and a child and young person might not have that. But it's really important, I think, just to be a little bit creative in how we respond and communicate. So saying something like, if you had 3 wishes and I had a magic wand and I could grant them, what would you change in your life? It's just another way of reframing, what do you want to happen here? What would be different in your life if I could magically change it? And it's an incredibly important question to ask. And I don't know how many of you do ask that, but I do know it doesn't always happen. It's very easy to go from referral to work without having this conversation. Do you think? Some nods. I mean, I know that from having worked with counsellors of children and young people for a long time, it can be, particularly the younger the child, it can be very easy to make assumptions and be quite ageist. And this is also an important question, because sometimes the answer that you have is something you can't work with in therapy. A child might say, I want mum and dad to stop arguing. Therapy with me is not going to be able to help that to happen, but it can give you a clue and an insight, and also another way to communicate with the child about, well, okay, I don't know that I can change what mum and dad are doing, but I can hear that it's bothering you and you would like that to change. Is there something we could do on that together? Would you like me to talk with mum and dad with you here? So it's a way of maybe sometimes seeking permission to work with something outside of therapy with a parent. Sometimes young people who find parents, they say, you know, don't listen or don't understand me. I quite often set homework for parents that I negotiate with the young person. And that can be incredibly powerful for the young person. So very often, one of my favourite homeworks that I set with young people when they say, well, you know, mum doesn't really listen or we don't have fun. And I said, well, how would it be? Would it be good for you if we get mum or dad to maybe spend time with you, just a half an hour each week at the same time, and you get to choose an activity? Really, I've never had a child say no. And that's something that I do with some care, because sometimes parents say no, and that can be very tough on a child. Or a parent will say yes and not stick to it. But it still can be an important way of just finding out something about the context of the child, that question, and being realistic with them about what can help and what can't help. Does that make sense? That being in therapy with me isn't going to stop mum and dad arguing, but maybe we can work on how you feel about that, or what you can say to that them, or how you can keep yourself safe in that setting. And then the next one is the tasks and preferences. What do you think is the youngest child I've negotiated around my way of working with? Preferences, around what type of therapy they wanted. What would you say?
4, 5?
5. Yeah, I've had several 5 and 6 year olds say to me, well, you know, what exactly is this then? And how exactly is this going to help me? And I remember saying to one child something very, very loose, and, you know, it was at the beginning of my career. So I said something like, well, if I sit here and I understand you and we just play, magically, I find things change. And she was like, but exactly how is that going to work? Exactly how is that going to work? And I thought, yes, you're right. I need to work on my contracting here. I'm not being clear. I'm being far too wishy-washy. So I learned to talk with children and say, well, you know, what we can do here is up to you. And I can help work out with you if it's going to be helpful. Like, maybe, do you want to use the time playing? Do you want to use the time talking to me? Do you want to do something more structured? So having these conversations with little ones is not difficult once you've made a commitment or sort of changed your thinking around that. Negotiating around the activities, and then being honest about whether or not they can help. And I will say things like, well, sometimes for some people they find that just playing can just feel nice and it can be helpful, but sometimes emotions get worked out in the sand tray and they can help you feel better by doing that. So finding language to explain concepts in a way that's accessible, again, is the responsibility for therapists. So not to avoid that, not to make assumptions that they can't engage, but to have those conversations. I'm just going to plug my iPad in because it's gone out and it's got my slides on, so I can see what's coming next. Outcomes is a really important one, I think. That is linked to tasks and preferences. And even before I described myself as pluralistic and person-centred, when I was person-centred, I still did this. I might not have named it tasks and preferences. I might not have called it those words in that type of a structured way. But always have I felt it was important to negotiate with clients of any age what they want to do and what they want to get. And how do we know therapy has worked is a very important question to ask. So when we've negotiated around what it is we would like to be different, how are we going to know when that's happened? How do we know? What would life look like if this is successful? Because you don't want a client coming for years on end and we don't ever know how to end it or when to end it appropriately. And children have often asked me, like, how long is this going to take them? And that's a really important question. But I think responding creatively, it's not a method. So although I'll show you a couple of little tools, they're not the thing that makes a difference, really. It's an attitude. It comes from having an attitude of deeply wanting to understand the client and a deep respect for meeting as equals with a 5 and a 6 year old even. For really having a respect for them and their capacity to collaboratively co-create and to individualise therapy. Does that make sense? And that there is some sensitivity needed around that, because I also remember I had a client, and I would say to clients, you know, how I work really is non-directively. So I'm not going to give you things to do, but I'll talk with you about what you want to do, or I can give you a range of things. And I had a client who would just say, can you just tell me what to do? And I was like, no, I can't, because I'm person-centered. I don't do that. And we would have these real conversations until I learned actually she had too much responsibility that was inappropriate in her life, and she needed to come to therapy and let go and have someone else be in charge. So we negotiated around her not being in charge and me being in charge for some of that therapy. Now that was a bit of a struggle for me, but not so much for her, because that's what she needed. So to collaboratively, for me to take control of a session and give her tasks was a huge stretch. But it was really helpful for her, because she would come and just let go and lie on the floor and be told what to do for a little bit. And for her, that was a huge relief, because she was in a situation with warring parents. Does that make sense? Yes, Ashley, goals and wishes very often very different to what a parent wants. Absolutely. And I've always seen it as creating a bubble. So we have a parent relationship, and then I create a bubble around the child. And then there's this little go-between bit that I think is a responsibility of the therapist to hold that. But very important to pay attention to that. So what does that look like in practice? So I thought I would share here a case study. Obviously I've anonymised, so the person's not recognisable. But Rima was referred to me, came to me privately for OCD. And she called them her habits, and these were around hand washing and touching items. And Mum was finding the routine very difficult, and it was getting longer and longer. And so Layla was saying, I can't go to sleep, and would stay out for hours with this routine of touching and washing. And if it had gone wrong, she'd have to start again from the beginning. And it was pushing 2 hours some nights. She was exceptionally bright and creative, very likeable, very clever, very dramatic, very adult in her presentation. And she said, I'm always overthinking. I even worry about worrying. I really did like her. And she said, I have got to do the routines because I always imagine that lots of bad things will happen. She told me when I'm sometimes in the car and I look and I see the sun, and then I imagine the sun exploding and we're all going to melt. So she had this amazing imagination that would sort of take her into all these places, and that's what her routines were about. So one of the ways to just make it visual and to introduce art is to use a bar chart. Really simple. I like to draw these with the young people when I do them, and I often say, look, you know, we could put this on paper, we could use a chart. Do you want a bar chart, a pie chart, a bunch of points? How would you like to do it? So always really important, I think, to give it to them. And a bar chart is a really simple way. So it's simple at the side, 0 to 10, on a scale of 0 being nothing and 10 being like really a lot. How worried are you about your habits? And then they can draw it. And that visual representation, most young people seem to quite like, probably because they do this stuff at school, don't they? So it's quite familiar. Most kids suggest bar charts. So here, it also helps, I guess I'm very visual, but it helps. It's like taking a shot of what's going on in their life to some degree. So here, Rima was about an 8 on her worry level for her habits. Her family, she said not too much, she was about 6 or 7. She wasn't worried about school. She said, I'm really clever, I'm not worried about school, that's fine. She was worried about her anxiety. She said, I'm always worrying. I'm always worrying. I feel very anxious, and that makes me anxious. Her worries, her anxiety was past 10. She said it's bigger than a 10 even. And she was also worried a little bit about her friendships. She said sometimes the things with friendships, she said not too much, but sometimes that's a worry. So that's the first part of contracting. Is this interesting so far? Okay, good. So then the next stage is to say, okay, what would this look like if we fixed it all and therapy was successful and it all was better, what would it be like? And really interesting, clients, young clients, hardly ever say it needs to go down to 0. And for Rima, she pegged it at 4. She said, if everything's a 4, that's okay. I don't need it to be nothing but a 4. She said, some worry is normal. So Such insight, don't you think, from young ones? If you work with children and young people, you will know that already. So we agreed here that, okay, well, this is what we'll do then. And when it's at a 4, we will know that we can maybe stop therapy. So she was really happy with that. The next question, how long is it going to take them to get to a 4? That's the next logical question, isn't it? So with REMA, and this, I do this often, how long is a piece of string, is I just draw it out on paper. Right, if we're here at this dot, and this is where we're starting, and we need to get to number 4, how long do you think that's going to take? Now, most often, young people don't always know, and I can't know. I don't know how long therapy is going to take. So it's a bit of a dumb question in some respects. However, it can give an indication, and it's a really good thing to start to have dialogue over, whether this is going to be a week or 3 weeks or a year or 10 years. Because it's also about managing expectations and understanding the expectations of the young person. Sometimes young people come thinking, I'll come for 1 session and it'll all be okay. So it's an important conversation to have, I think. So with Rima, from my memory, I remember her saying something like, oh, it's going to take years. This is really bad and it's probably going to take years and years. And I think I said something along the lines of probably, well, hopefully not, and I don't think it will, you know, but if it does, I can do that if you're okay with that. So it's a way of being able to really connect and set the tone. It's also really helpful review tool because from time to time you can get the paper back out. And often in my experience, the children and young people will ask, will say, can we get that out and see where we are? Isn't that just amazing? Isn't that an empowering thing? Something as simple as using a piece of paper and a line gives permission for them to take ownership of this contracting. And I think it was probably 7 months or so later, we got it out and she said we were about halfway. She was about halfway there. It was a review session we were having. So we went from not knowing and it's going to be years to her saying, oh, we're about halfway there. So negotiating around preferences. Rena said she wanted structured exercises. So we talked it through and we made a decision, and I gave her this booklet that she would make a note of what habits she had, how often she did them, how long they took, and then we would talk about it in sessions, and then she would make targets for herself. We would decide on them. So if touching the door handle lasted for an hour, she would try and then get that down to half an hour. Right, so she sort of structured this CBT type thinking that she wanted to do. So we said, okay, fine. Every week she came with really creative ideas and excuses why she couldn't do it. She had, oh, I was going to do it, but this happened, that happened, the other happened. And this went on for weeks on end, which was quite fascinating to me because she was acting as though I was the one imposing this structure when really it was coming from her anyway. And it took me a little bit of a while just to understand that really fundamentally she didn't want to do it. And it made me reflect on what is it she really did want then from therapy. So we talked about why she wasn't doing the charts. And she said there's too much hassle. I've got lots of homework and there's just too much of a problem. But I also discovered when she sat at a friend's house, she didn't have habits. So at that point, it started to connect for me that actually this is much more connected to the parents than I had realised. And Mum was also present at a review, which I'll talk about. But Rena loved horses. And I had this thing that I quite often say, it was lucky that she loved horses, because I started to think about her and her context and what was really going on. And I think in my experience often, kids who are very creative and very imaginative will often worry a lot. It's part of, it's that I see it as a survival thing. If you're a worrier, you're less likely to get eaten by a tiger that comes in the cave, because if you've been worrying, you'd have probably done something about it. Do you know what I mean? If you don't worry, you're going to go and step out in front of a truck and get knocked over. So just natural selection, I think. People who don't worry probably died out quicker than the ones who do. This is what I like to tell young people anyway. So I said to her, look, imagine, I said, I know you like horses, and we were talking, and I said, you know, like those Arabian thoroughbred horses that have been bred just for racing, and they're so beautiful and they've got such a capacity for racing. And she told me about their temperament, because they're like, you know, quite energetic, I think, or a bit, what did she say? Prima donna-ish. Anyway, so what do you think if we put that Arabian racehorse and we put it in a tiny little field, what do you think would happen to that racehorse? And she said, well, it would get really unhappy and it'd probably just go round and round in circles because it's got nowhere to run. It can't run, it can't use its potential. And I said to her, do you think that's what maybe happens with your imagination? That maybe you've got this super imagination and you're not using it enough, and it goes round and round in circles in your worries. Do you think maybe that could be part of it? And she said, yeah, maybe. So I said, okay, why don't you take another book, and instead of doing the charts, why don't you take some time each day and use your imagination to write a story or a poem, anything you want to write, but you need to write something every day for me, and then we'll bring it back here and then we can talk about it. And we negotiated all of this, and I explained to her why I didn't, because I think it's really important. If I'd have just come up with this on my own and imposed it, that's not collaborative working with children and young people, and it really mattered that I talked about it with her. Mum was at the review session and she was really anxious, and so I took that opportunity to talk with Mum about whether she might work on her own anxiety. And that could be a difficult, tricky conversation to have with parents, but a necessary one, to say, look, how do you expect your child to be less anxious if you don't know how to be managing your own anxiety? And that can often be an important conversation to have with clients and client mums and dads. And I also suggested to Mum that she just let go of worrying about the habits. I said, let Rima manage her habits, don't worry about them. And Mum was like, but she doesn't go to bed early enough. I don't know what to do. And then we're up till midnight. I was like, okay, well, why don't you just start bedtime 3 hours early to allow for time for the habits? How about just doing that for a bit and don't worry about it? Which was quite fascinating, actually, because obviously I don't think Rima liked that very much, because she clearly was using it to manipulate her parents into staying up later. But anyway, Mum let go of it. Within a very short space of time, actually, things started to change. So we had another review session. Rima's worry about her habits reduced. She was really not that bothered about them in the first place, I don't think. But look, her worries about her friends went through the roof. Her anxiety had come down a little bit. I think this must have been a year in, I think, maybe, I don't know. School had gone up. Some things weren't going so well at school because she was having arguments with her friends at school. Family was roughly about the same. But this, to me, just seemed like, okay, there was some stuff in her life that's happening that are causing these contextualised worrying. Does that make sense? Arguments with friends are a relevant thing to worry about, aren't they, when you're that age and you're at school? And she was getting excluded and things like that. But her habits, her worries about habits went down. And a few weeks later, she just said, you know what, I don't feel that anxious about things anymore. Let's just do the chart again. She said, I've still got my habits and I worry, I'm just not that bothered about it. So we did the chart again, and that had really gone down. And I love this. I love when kids say, can we do this chart again? And then it's gone down, as though it's like something external, when all they're doing is externalising what's going on internally. Does that make sense? They're just being really explicit. And they are so excited to see. She was like, oh my God, it's really gone down. And children often are very excited about how it's changed. And what was really interesting for me with her, she said, okay, well, here, she said, this line here, she said, they're not down to like a 4, she said, but they're sort of at a 5, and I think that's okay. And I think we're ready to end, really. She said, maybe it's okay to be at a 5 if I average it out. So, okay. So she was ready around that time to end when it got to that point. So, any questions or any comments about that? What did you think? My fantasy is that you all do this anyway, and I've told you nothing of any interest or newness.
Hi, Annie. I really enjoyed that. I'm going to be starting as a school counsellor in August, so all of these little tips will be fab. And I've just finished a placement with Place to Be. So this whole kind of creative and therapeutic contracting was really a huge part of it. There might be some Place to Be people here. So that was a huge learning curve. I suppose I one of the questions I had, sometimes you have very creative and artistic children, and then other times you have kids that don't want to even touch the crayons or the sandpit or anything, and they're very reluctant. So I had kind of two of each. So some that we did really creative contracting, glitter balls and loads of really interesting sessions, and then the others that really didn't even want to touch pen to paper. And I wondered if you've any kind of tips around how to kind of engage those more creatively, or if we need to, if they're not comfortable with it.
Well, I think that, the tip is not to engage them, but for you to engage where they're at. So if somebody doesn't want to use glitter, it's asked, well, what would you like to use? Do you want to use the iPad? How do you want to do it digitally? Do you, go with what they want to do. And if they don't want to do that, find out how they would like to do it then. So it's not about imposing, it's just about finding a way to create for you, your creative thinking to engage, to find a way to connect with what would suit them. Does that help? Does that make sense?
That's where we were going with it. Thank you.
Good. Tatiana, you've got your hand up.
Yes. Hello, and thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the workshop. I got some new ideas for myself. Definitely will try to use it. I have recently started working with children, and it is quite a journey, I would say. So, and my thoughts about it, because I literally only had like 3 little clients now, and I'm working in a primary school. So with one of my clients, we worked like very goal-oriented, and he was ready for it, and it was amazing intervention. He got exactly what he wanted from it. Just an amazing experience for me all over, like through all the process. But and I will second the lady who talked before me with the rest of them, and I think it was because it was their first experience of therapy, so they didn't know what to expect. So I would say that I wasn't ready for this moment of collaboration when we were working around the contract. And one of the clients, the girl, she wasn't actually really keen on doing counseling. And it was our only, like in the middle of the process on the session, so she was up for 10 sessions. We decided that she would better go, so she would stop counseling because she's not feeling it, she's not enjoying it, she feels like she was pushed into it. It was not her decision from the very beginning. So I just, let her go. Absolutely. And I think it gave her a very good experience of being able to do something by her choice.
Very important. Sometimes that is the most important point in therapy, is to enable a child to have that voice to say, no, I don't want to come. Or yes, I do want to come. I think it's so important and so wise. And it's unethical to work with children who don't want to be in therapy. And that's a really tricky place to be in at times in some contexts, and particularly in private practice. It can take some strength to say to a parent, I don't think your child needs to be here and doesn't want to be here, when somebody's paying you money and go fix my child in your bed.
And I think also for her, it took her 4 sessions to actually being able and to voice this. Yeah. Though I was strongly encouraging her to voice if she really wants to, because she didn't have goals, and I've seen that she doesn't want to be in the therapy, no matter what would I do. So it just, and with the other child, it didn't happen. We didn't make the contract, and it was really difficult to engage him in it. So he just stayed for 10 sessions, and I think he had something from it. But I wasn't able to find this way to actually work on what he wants, because he didn't know, and it's very difficult. I know that it is a lack of experience on my side to actually be able and to explain the child what is therapy, is what can therapy offer to them.
I think it's just learning. We're all on a learning curve. Yeah. And I think just ask the clients, just ask and say, was this helpful? Was this session not helpful? Or what to understand? Was it rubbish? Was it good? Was it not good? And I find that the more you ask, the more they'll be able to say. And that might be, I don't know what I'm doing here. So I feel like I'm wasting my time. And that gives you the opportunity to then say, okay, what would be like, what could we do that isn't wasting time then? What do you think? Or should we try? And they might, I remember somebody said to me, oh, I think my mum's paying, so I think you should have some ideas. It's just like, okay, well, I've got some ideas. What about this and this and that? And I like to give choices. And from that position, collaboratively work with them on what might be helpful and not. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So maybe that's helpful. So, okay, so the next part, I thought I would share with you this other thing. I don't know if you've come across a life pie before. Has anyone done a life pie? Ah, good. Good. I do like to show new things and not bore. Okay, so here's where you get to take your pen and paper out and do a life pie. This often works with this works, honestly, I do it a lot with adults. I'm going to do it with you in a genuine way, but it works. Sometimes this works better with slightly older people, children and young people, younger people who don't really want to do a bar chart. Often with teens, I do this. It's called a life pie. So I'd like you to draw a circle and divide that circle into 8 segments of pie. And don't worry about it not being a perfect circle. It doesn't matter at all. Most of them are quite scrappy. When you've done that, I'd like you to put a heading around each of those segments. So segment 1 would be friends and family. Segment 2, money, finance. Segment 3 is learning or personal development. Segment 4, spirituality, well-being. Then health. Then personal relationships. Then work, whether it's paid or unpaid. And then fun or adventure. I know this says leisure, and so I like to say fun and adventure. And the beauty of this is you can adapt it to anything. So you can adapt this with young people. I'll often adapt it to like friendships, school. Do you know what I mean? Just make the headings up. Have 6 segments if you want 6 segments and you don't want 8. It doesn't really matter. The point is that we're just making something visual. So externalising what's going on internally has got multiple benefits. Firstly, there's just often a sense of relief in a client to externalise, but it can help them see what's going on in their life, but it also lets you in. So it's a really important part of therapy, I think, to externalise. Okay. Everyone okay with that so far? Yeah, okay. Now what I'd like you to do is put a dot in where you think. So if the centre is like 0 and the outer edge of the segment is like the 10, the maximum, put where you feel you are at the moment. So if you feel like your finance is okay, it's not great, could be better, it's middling, put your dot there. If you think you've been doing loads of learning and you've been here today and you've been doing loads of PD, put it there. So put the dot where it represents where you are in your life at the moment. And I'll allow a bit more time for this because I think sometimes it takes a little bit of reflection to just think about. And you're not going to have to share this with anybody, so you can be, as honest as you want to be with yourself. And doing this can be really eye-opening for clients, because when people come to therapy, and I'm thinking sort of adults, but even with teenagers, and they say, well, I'm really unhappy and I don't know why, because my life's lovely. And then they do this and all the dots are near the centre. They can start to see that actually, yeah, look, I can see you don't have many friends. You don't have much, in the way of relationships, school's rubbish and you're not going out much. And yeah, I can see why you're feeling low. Does that make sense? It can really help people to identify it and see for themselves. Yes, I think it is. Yes, Ashley, I think it is a tool that's often used in coaching. But yeah, and I just adapt these headings to each client, and I think that's the whole point of pluralism, isn't it? Is to adapt and to pay attention to preferences and adapt and individualise therapy with each client. But yeah, it is used in coaching, and yeah, youth worker, brilliant that you're already using this. Okay, so then the next step is join the dots. Okay, so what do your shapes look like so far? Maybe not quite as rounded as they could be. Or have you all got lovely rounded lives? Interesting, isn't it? Doing this is really interesting. I do it from time to time for myself, just for fun, just to see where I'm at. But doing this, it can be a really interesting talking point. I remember with some young people saying, gosh, my life's really spiky. Or they can really see how it's unbalanced. Often what I do is I'll ask them to colour in the centre bit. Now comes another part that I want you to do, which is I would now like you to imagine, okay, if I had a magic wand and could grant you wishes and your life could be how you wanted it to be, where would you place the dots? What do you want your life to look like? So put the dots where you would like your life to look like. And then when you've done that, again, join the dots. And I've gone 2 slides ahead here, but never mind. And then maybe colour in that shape that it's created. So when you've done that, what you've got is a real, you've got like a snapshot, haven't you, of somebody's aims for therapy. You've got a little snapshot here, a little personal prescription of which areas of their life need working on. Don't you think there's a beauty in that, isn't there? That it's just done visually. When you do something like this, you can say, okay, well, look, there's maybe some work needs doing on your spiritual life, on your well-being. What is it that you need to work on there? Health's fine, your relationships, work's fine, but look at your leisure and social where you're not going out. What could change there that might have an impact on how you feel about life? So it's a really good tool for starting conversations with young people of any age, and adults really, to start to see what in their life needs changing. Because therapy can be one thing, but it's seeing them in the whole context. So I thought I'll just give a couple of minutes really before we need to end, just to see, what did you think of that? Was that good, boring, interesting? And to see if you wanted to share anything of what you've done and what about your own, the shape of your lives.
I find that really interesting, thank you. Everything's completely new to me because I'm just kind of at the start of my counselling training journey, so thank you for that. I thought it was really interesting, the next steps in the life chart, so that you're getting that sort of colour visualisation. And it was very similar to, my one was very similar to the one that you had actually. So I need to think about what I can do with my spiritual life. And I guess none of us are going out maybe as much as we have like in the past, so perhaps that's not surprising. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you for the whole overview and everything. It's all been really interesting from my perspective.
You're very welcome. But it's like a personal prescription, isn't it? It's a personal little snapshot. Thank you.
So the contracting thing is still kind of in my mind. I thought that was really good, and actually we called it something different in youth work, but it was quite a similar concept. So it's, and I've never used it with adults, but I certainly will now. I'm just coming to the end of my master's, and our project, we had to produce a pluralistic resource. So I've actually designed a board game to use with children to talk about what counselling is, what they can expect, what it's not. It's kind of like a snakes and ladders type game, but it gives the child a chance to kind of share a little bit about them, and the counsellor a chance to kind of explain a bit about the process and what they can expect, and that they don't need to be there. But there's lots of different cards, and then a kind of younger version. But I think it's maybe somewhere on the slideshow if anyone was interested. And yeah, I thought it was quite, I was kind of thinking, how will I use my game if I ever get it produced? Because do you use it before your contract, and do you contract first, and then you're using a board game that maybe is a bit repetitive. So it's given me food for thought on a selfish note. But if there are any children,
sounds amazing. I look forward to seeing that.
Yeah, so it's got good feedback from my placements and so on. So I kind of hope to be able to do something with it and to kind of share it on the
What uni are you at?
I'm just finishing with Abertay, the pluralistic masters there. So
okay, so they'll be asking you to write something for the blog, I'm sure.
I think so, maybe. We'll
Good.
see. But
No,
thank
I
you.
look forward to that.
Thanks, Annie.
Yeah, did anyone else have any comments or questions?
I just had a question, and thank you so much for the presentation, because I'm in training as well, and it's been absolutely invaluable. I was just wondering, how would you discuss confidentiality with children? Because I've really struggled in my placements. I'm okay with talking about the structural bits, but when it comes to confidentiality, it's just like breaking it down in a language that kids will understand, especially 5-year-olds. How would you explain confidentiality?
What is it that you find difficult about the language, Ashley? Is it Ashley?
Yes. It's just, when we talk about confidentiality as adults, we naturally understand what it is and what the meaning of it is. How would you simplify it for children in a creative way?
Oh, okay. I think, well, how I explain it, if you find that helpful, is I just say to children that, look, when you come here, it's really important that you know that I'm not going to talk about anything you tell me. I'm not going to tell your mum, I'm not going to tell your school, except if I'm really concerned that you're going to get hurt, or that you're hurting somebody else, or you're doing something really dangerous, like, for example. And then I just give examples. But I also say to the child that, look, you can talk about what happens in here. You can talk to mum, you can talk to dad, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can, and you can tell your friends, but I can't talk. Because it's really important to some children, and you never know what's going on with the children that you're working with, can sometimes they've been in relationships with people who have made them not feel safe to speak up, or they're keeping secrets, particularly around abuse. They might be in an abusive relationship. So it can be really important to reiterate that they're free to talk about it. They don't have to keep the relationship private. You're keeping it private to protect them, and you're not going to tell mum and you're not going to tell dad, but you will if they want you to tell something, because sometimes a young person or a child might want you to be their voice. Does that help, Ashley?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, Ashley, I was reading your comment. Yeah, absolutely. If somebody's got a life-limiting condition, or even if it's not, even if they're just having bad health, it can be something that might not be movable all the time, and that can be part of what is talked about in therapy. Is that, yeah, like, this health thing is not good, and that isn't necessarily going to change. So yeah, but did you have another question, Ashley?
Well, I know we're coming to the end of our time, Annie. Thank you very much. I was just thinking about confidentiality. Quite often I would check out with the child what they understand about confidentiality and privacy, because sometimes it's really useful to know how much they know already, or their own understandings of what it means to keep something private and confidential, as well as doing my contracting about, just what you were saying. You can talk about what happens in here, but I won't be talking to mum or dad or friends without your consent, unless there is a situation where you or somebody else is in danger, and so being able to check out their understanding.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. But yeah, absolutely check out their understanding. Yeah, and make sure that they, well, yeah, that's part of the responsibility, is to make sure that they understand and see what they understand. And they can have very different ideas. Kids are often very used to people talking about them. So it's really important to stress that. But also they can have fantasies about the limitations of what do you mean when I'm in danger? Well, my friend was horrible to me. Does that, they can have fantasies about what that looks like. So I think giving examples, like I think I say something along the lines of, if you tell me that you're stealing sweets from the shop, I'm not really going to care about that. But if you tell me you're driving a car and you're 10, I'm not going to be comfortable with that, and I will tell somebody about that. So giving like real examples of my idea of what danger is, or my idea of crime, because they may think, you know, I stole some sweets and my counsellor will tell me. Can be very big for some young people. But anyway, we're bang on, 2 minutes over. I should forgive myself for that. So thank you so much for coming. I hope that was helpful. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, and see you back in the main room in half an hour. Thank you very much.